Just before 7:50 on Thursday morning, August the 13th, 2015. I am Grant McHill alongside Storm Kennedy.
And our guest this morning in studio, Eugene Police Lieutenant Scott Fellman, part of CopTalk this morning. Good morning, Lieutenant. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, a recent report says in the next 50 years, Lieutenant, that a massive earthquake is going to hit the state of Oregon. Plus many wildfires in this area of the state leads us to think about disaster preparedness.
Yeah, and as it happens, as we're going into that, looking at that news and moving forward, that next month is in fact National Preparedness Month. So we wanted to come and talk to people and start getting folks thinking about that and preparing themselves for the kinds of things that might happen, and so they can get through them as safely as possible.
And before we start on disaster preparedness, I mean, this could have been a disaster last night. Bailey Hill, there was a fire along Bailey Hill and also out in Lorain. Eugene Springfield Fire and Eugene Police were on the Bailey Hill fire immediately and got it out and got it under control. What could have been a major disaster was a minor one. But can you just touch on that a little bit before we start?
Sure. We're very fortunate that got reported as quickly as it did and that fire crews were able to get out there so quickly and extinguish it. Obviously, it's so dry out right now, being on a hill and with all the wind they had yesterday, could have been a major disaster. And we're very fortunate that we were able to get to it and get it extinguished. It's a good reminder, especially for people who smoke. You see them driving down the road with their cigarettes hanging out the window. Don't toss those cigarettes on the road. People don't realize what a danger that is, and they can go bouncing across the roadway and end up starting a fire hours later.
So obviously you were prepared for that fire yesterday, but thinking big picture for disaster preparedness, how is the Eugene Police Department preparing?
The police department is focused primarily on looking at how we're going to be able to respond if there's a major disaster. And a big part of that discussion is starting to talk about our own personnel and how we're going to be prepared so that we can know that our families are set and come in and help other people, which leads to the discussion of everybody else thinking about the same thing. What can you do at home? What should you be doing at home to prepare yourself? It's easy, on any given day to think, well, if I need some water or I need some food, I'll just run down to the store and I'll get it. But if there's a major disaster, particularly something like a major earthquake, going to the store may not be an option.
So with Disaster Preparedness Month coming our way in September, when and how do we need to prepare?
You need to be preparing now. If you wait until the disaster, obviously it's too late, and it can seem like kind of a daunting task. So one of the recommendations from our emergency management department and emergency planners across the country is to do a little bit every week. Each time you go to the store, buy a little extra bottled water, buy a little bit of extra shelf-stable food, put together a kit that you can travel with, and just start building those supplies now. How much should you have? At least 3 days of food and water, particularly water. Ideally, it would be good for everybody to have 2 weeks worth. But really, if we had a major earthquake like the one that they're forecasting as a possibility in the next 40 or 50 years, it could be months before our infrastructure is back up and running, and you really want to be prepared for that. Think about yourself in your home, but also think about your neighbors, your local community. Who can you depend on? Who can you work with to survive stuff if somebody's house falls down and yours doesn't? Where are the supplies and how are you going to get through stuff? And then make plans with your family.
As a police officer, I'm curious about this, Lieutenant. Personally, it's got to be tough when there's a disaster because you want to be with your family and you want to help your family. But as an officer, you want to help the city and you want to stop looting. So how do you personally, as an officer, prepare for something like this?
Well, we hope in Eugene that looting wouldn't be a problem. And so we prepare the community for that through these kinds of conversations, talking about being prepared so you don't need to loot. Make sure that you've got the supplies that you need at home ready to go or in your vehicle ready to go so that you don't have to worry about that. Otherwise, it's the same thing that everybody else does. We have to be prepared. We have to have a backup plan. Those of us that have kids, we have a range of child care options in mind. Friends in different parts of town, family in different parts of town, and we have backup plans, hopefully, for where we would go and what we would do so that we're able to get to work as quickly as possible.
Speaking of work, Lieutenant Fellman, as Grant asks you, how do you prepare? We talk about being prepared at home and having a family plan. What about, many of us will be at work if the disaster happens, and can you touch on that, businesses being prepared?
Absolutely. Same basic principles apply. If for your workplace, there ought to be a supply, because you may not be able to leave work depending on what happens. There ought to be a supply in the workplace of food, of water, emergencies, first aid supplies, things to get you through at least a little while until you can get to someplace else, at least a couple of days. And to have that as part of your family plan as well, that if parents are at work or certain family members are at work, when a disaster strikes, the original plan of everybody being at home and doing everything together may not work. So you want to have some backup plans and have that thought out before it happens so it's not such a surprise.
If Eugene is the center or Springfield is the center for a disaster, is there an evacuation plan already set up for the city?
Not necessarily, because there's so many variables as far as where a problem might happen, what resources would still be available to move to. So some of that stuff there are certainly plans for, but some of it would have to be adapted on depending on what's happened in a particular event.
Speaking of resources, there are a couple of public events that are coming up here in the actually very short time. In a couple of weeks, we'll be into September.
Yeah, Eugene's Emergency Management Department will have several public events next month. We don't have the specifics of those yet, but we want to make people aware that those are coming. Watch for the details on that. And if you want to know more about emergency management, the city's emergency management website has a lot of easy links with good information and even some access to some websites that have some fun little games for family preparedness stuff. And you can find that at eugene-or.gov/emergency management.
And Lieutenant, before we let you go, kind of a parting note here. Top of your mind for families at home, how many bottles of water should we have? How many pieces of canned food? Just on a daily basis. Do you have something in mind?
A good guideline, what FEMA and a lot of the national emergency management organizations recommend is that you have a gallon per day per person in your family or in your household.
And how many days do we want to prepare for?
Ideally, should have at least 3 days worth. But really, if we had a major disaster, it's a good likelihood that you might have to go a couple of weeks. So 2 weeks is recommended. But it's entirely possible that it could be longer than that, again, depending on what happens and how long it takes to get supplies moving. But there's just so many things to think about. And if you start putting away a little bit of water today, a little bit of food every time you go to the store, before you know it, you'll have a good supply of emergency supplies.
He is Lieutenant Scott Fellman from the Eugene Police Department. Lieutenant, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
We are KUGN News Talk 590.